Before we begin today's video, note that I will be talking about the story of Age of Calamity. There will be spoilers, such as the game's ending, so proceed with caution. There's been talk of the champion clones on the tapestry representing the future quote-unquote champions. And if the robot finds a way to bring them back to the past to participate in the Great Calamity battle, I'm done. I personally hope at the very least it ends in inevitable failure.
I mean, technically they still have the camera rune, but what would they do with that? Photo shoot Ganon to death?
I'm not even mad about that last one, I just think it's hilarious. Okay, jokes aside with that whole beginning skit, Age of Calamity is a great game. I said this in my previous video, but if you loved Breath of the Wild, you will find enjoyment in this game. I wouldn't go as far as to say the story itself was terrible. The biggest issue for me was its marketing and the expectations set because of said marketing. Now, Nintendo themselves never used the word prequel when advertising Age of Calamity. They frequently described this game as taking place 100 years before the events of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which technically is true. However, the addition of stuff such as a quote from King Rome,
"I think you are now ready to hear what happened 100 years ago,"
which is something only said from Breath of the Wild, led to the assumption that this takes place just before that game. Obviously, this isn't the case. Age of Calamity aren't the events leading up to Breath of the Wild, because by the end, there is no Breath of the Wild to lead up to. I see people on Twitter, my comment section, Discord server, who are surprised to hear that this isn't a prequel. Forget the quality of the story itself, the confusion of what Age of Calamity is supposed to be is probably the game's biggest flaw. My saltiness was definitely at Rivali levels when finishing the game, but that's simply because I wasn't a fan of the direction the story went due to said expectations. So let's talk about the story itself. The best way I can describe it is Breath of the Wild fanfiction. There are a few reasons as to why I use this comparison. The game is filled with as much fan service as possible, finding excuses to add certain characters into the story. Terrako uses his time travel to bring the champions of Breath of the Wild to the past, who fight alongside the real champions, Princess and Hero. Second is that by the end of the game, everyone lives. And I mean everyone. Despite being surrounded by guardians at Hyrule Castle, it's later revealed that Rome was alive. And Terrako's sacrifice is short-lived since it's possible to repair him, which unlocks the game's secret ending. They go as far as to tell us that the king evacuated the nearby towns just before Ganon's return, giving us a grand total of 0 casualties on the protagonist's side. I mean, I'm sure that some people died, but you get the point. Now, we have good endings in Zelda. It happens all the time. The big baddie is stabby-stabbed with the Master Sword and sealed away by the princess with her flashy flash powers. However, Age of Calamity takes it a step further with the best possible conclusion for our protagonists. If you look at most other Zelda games, while they end on a positive note, it's not a perfect ending. Twilight Princess had Queen Rutella, who was executed in front of her people as a message to those who thought to oppose Zant. Ganondorf kills the sages of Earth and Wind prior to the events of The Wind Waker. Majora's Mask is filled with tragedy, whether it be the Deku Butler's son, Mikau, Darmani. At most, Age of Calamity has the death of the queen, but aside from that, the game ends on a high note. The only way I can describe it is fanfiction. All the character death we have is from the villain side. ASTOR, Calamity Ganon, and while one would argue that Suga's assumed death goes against my past statement, at the time he was still classified as a villain. Now, Harbinger Ganon is an interesting one, because we know that the malice which entered the portal in the introduction corrupted the Terrako of that timeline, and in a way that sort of counts as its own tragedy. As a matter of fact, the one Zelda remembers from her memory is the one that dies in the end. I do appreciate that part of the story since it is tragic, and the key events of this game play out very differently. Best example is the Master Sword. Breath of the Wild established that Link was already an accomplished knight and holder of the blade long before he was selected to be the hero and Zelda's escort. In Age of Calamity, Zelda and Link have known each other for a while by the time he gets the Master Sword from the Korok Forest. There is also the battles of both Fort Hateno and the Akkala Citadel. But just because it's a fanfiction style plot, it doesn't make the game itself bad. And there are things to appreciate about its story, as well as some valid reasoning as to why the developers went down this route. When I first started playing the game, I wasn't really invested in the gameplay. Not because it was bad. In fact, Koei Tecmo did a phenomenal job with making the game feel as Breath of the Wild as possible. It's just that hack and slash video games aren't my kind of thing. I was there for one thing only: the story. And because of this, the first half of the gameplay felt very slow. It wasn't until the Great Calamity started that I seriously got into the battles. Fighting hordes of guardians and laying waste to thousands of enemies with the divine beasts felt great. Since Breath of the Wild started with the player waking up 100 years after these events, with the game set in an already devastated Hyrule, everything we knew about the Great Calamity was limited to the memories, journal entries, character dialogue, and setting. Not being able to experience the events was one of the game's biggest flaws for me, since there was much less of an emphasis on the present-day story. Point is, even if Age of Calamity was a prequel and stayed true to the events of Breath of the Wild, the first bit of gameplay would have felt just as dull. Perhaps that's why they felt it was important to extend this bit of the game by introducing the future champions into the story as a means to save Mipha, Daruk, Revali, and Urbosa from the Blights. Whether it was a prequel or not, I'm sure that we all expected the events from the Great Calamity onward to be spaced out. And this just happens to be the route Koei Tecmo took to do so, rather than sticking to the main story. On the bright side, they're pretty clear from the get-go how this is in a separate timeline, and aren't trying to force the players to believe this is a new story, which would have ultimately clashed with Breath of the Wild's lore. Age of Calamity is simply a what-if scenario. The part I appreciate about it the most is how they were well aware of the key events of the Great Calamity. I assume that's one of the biggest influences the Zelda team had on the game's production. We get to see the battles of Akkala Citadel, Fort Hateno, even the Great Plateau. While these events play out very differently, it's locations which were important to the Great Calamity of Breath of the Wild. And this doesn't mean that everything from the timeline split isn't canon to that game's story. We get to see a younger version of Impa, Robbie, and Pura, the last two acting just like their older selves in Breath of the Wild. And there are still nods to the original story, like a scene closely resembling the Rogue Guardian incident at Hyrule Castle, Zelda awakening her power at Fort Hateno, something we talked about in the past video, and Link being a glutton. Ignoring the story itself, the presentation of the cutscenes in general was incredible. The cinematography, voice acting, soundtrack, and my personal favorite, the characters. The voice actors did an incredible job bringing these characters to life, each one having a distinct personality. Koga and Suga were so well done. Just by hearing some of their lines makes you realize that they are best boys.
Yiga, assemble! Me excluded, of course.
Master Koga.
Suga, you're late! I nearly got peeled like a banana!
Your Highness, I bring news. It regards your impending death. You are blind, seer. Calamity Ganon is not for mortals to control.
The Yiga clan in general were one of the highlights of the game for me. They felt a bit shallow in Breath of the Wild, since their motivation to side with Ganon was from what's essentially a 10,000-year-old grudge. By the end of the game, Koga and his followers join the good guys, and yes, that does sound like something out of a fanfiction. But I felt like it gave them a bit more depth in contrast to the typical mindless monster. I mean, they have emotions too, so being betrayed by ASTOR would definitely make them question whether they're on the right side or not. Also, every scene with them is just hilarious.
And indeed, the pride of all Hyrule. With your power, I believe you will seal away Calamity Ganon.
I felt that they could have done more with the new villain. The problem is, after you finish the game, you're left with a lot of unanswered questions regarding his past. Was he the fortune teller who prophesied Ganon's return? His description is Prophet of Doom, and he's referred to as a seer. More importantly, how will these new characters affect Breath of the Wild 2? Terrako was completely wiped from Breath of the Wild's timeline, but were ASTOR and Suga still involved in the original Great Calamity? Will the future champions reference this game in the sequel? The dialogue from Age of Calamity confirms that these characters were sent to the past after already teaming up with the hero to retake the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild. This brings us back to the question of why. Why bother making an alternate timeline as opposed to a true prequel? We already talked about the gameplay over story portion of it. The more fanfiction-like plot strengthened its gameplay. But there's also the age rating. No matter how you look at it, a lot of people died in the Great Calamity of Breath of the Wild. But with the existence of games such as Majora's Mask, with character death and moons destroying whole worlds, I definitely think that they could have made it work with Age of Calamity. And we don't need to see the actual moment these characters die. Kind of like how the camera follows Zelda and Link as they flee from Hyrule Castle, or how the screen flashes to white just before the champions are about to die. You don't have to show the player everything, and chances are the people playing this game also played Breath of the Wild. Perhaps it's an alternate timeline because of how badly Hyrule lost in the battle. The goal of most games is to win, but how is that possible with a story such as this? As I mentioned before, the biggest problem Age of Calamity faces is not necessarily the game itself, but how it was advertised. They should have been more transparent from the start that this was not going to be a prequel. It's good that they released a demo revealing the whole time travel thing from the start, but it would have been even better if this was a part of the initial trailer. Show a condensed version of the introduction, and combine that with some gameplay and other cinematics. There would be much less confusion from the fanbase, since time travel would already be established as a major plot point of the game. In the end, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is essentially the Avengers Endgame of Zelda. But one key difference between the two is that the latter still had sacrifices. The people who were snapped out of existence are brought back, but it's at a cost. Some people died for the sake of completing their mission. It's something that should have been done with a character like Cain Rome. I mean, it's not like they could repair Iron Man following Endgame's events. So, should you buy Age of Calamity? Even if the gameplay isn't your thing, if you adored Breath of the Wild, then pick it up. A lot of love was put into this game, and partway through you might even forget that it's supposed to be a Hyrule Warriors title. If you thought Breath of the Wild was just alright, then I'd recommend skipping it and watching the cutscenes on YouTube. That goes double for people who want to buy it thinking it's a prequel. It's not, so chances are you might be disappointed with what you get. And if you're thinking about picking it up for fan service, definitely get it. There's a lot of fan service in this game. Or if you just love Hyrule Warriors gameplay in general. Apparently the game sold over 3 million copies already, making it the most successful title in the series. So it will be interesting to see if more collaborations like this happen in other Zelda games. Thanks for watching today's video, and if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to the channel. I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I'll see you all next time.